Welcome to Canada's most irreverent talk show. This is the Andrew Lawton Show, brought to you by True North.
Welcome to the Andrew Lawton Show here on True North. This is a bit of a different show if you haven't been able to tell already by the setting. In politics, we often orient things around political parties. It's the Liberals versus the Conservatives versus the New Democrats. Independents do not historically have the best go of things in politics. Very few people have had success running as independents and winning. Oftentimes, people will get kicked out of a party caucus and finish out their term as an independent and then retire. But there are a few exceptions to that rule, and it's also important to look at what independents are able to do. So I wanted to take a look at that with someone who has very quickly established himself as, I think, a very unique and effective figure in Canadian politics, and that is Kevin Vuong, who is the independent member of Parliament for Spadina for York. And I was going to say he's joining me, but I'm joining you because we're in your home. So, Kevin, thank you very much for having me and for sitting down for this.
No, it's my pleasure. Thanks for joining me here.
So let's discuss first off why you are an independent, because you were on the ballot as a Liberal. You ran for the Liberals, but during the campaign were basically kicked out of the running after the ballots had already been printed, and you still won, which was quite an achievement. So the party made a decision in that period, and I want to hear in your words what happened there. Why did that happen?
Sure. So there was a bogus allegation made against me years ago that was withdrawn by the court. They realized that the false allegation of sexual assault was completely bogus. So it was completely withdrawn, no conditions, not in the public interest to pursue was the prosecutor's words, which I think a lot of people appreciate that when it comes to lawyers, they're very intentional about the words that they use. And they didn't say no reasonable prospect of conviction or any of that. So that was withdrawn, dealt with, until magically 4 days before the election, it resurfaced again. And so I guess in the throes of the general election and the final few days, the Liberals made the decision that while we were supposed to be scheduled to have a chat about it and get the full debrief, my opinion was at the end of the day, if an allegation of charge is withdrawn, it no longer exists. But their opinion for some reason changed. And so 3 days before the election, I got essentially an email that says, Kevin, you are no longer a Liberal, which was really hard at the time. I was new to politics, new to partisan politics, but I guess has been a bit of a blessing in disguise.
Just to not gloss over this part, there were also issues about disclosing it to the Liberal Party and also to the Navy, where you were and are a reservist. And you have said that was a mistake on your part in past interviews, have you not?
Yes. So there is, as a reservist, as a member of the Canadian Armed Forces, we have the obligation to disclose a charge, even if you're innocent like I was. And ignorance is not an excuse. And so I own that. That is something that I should have done. And even though the charge was ultimately withdrawn, and that's something where I accept the military's ruling. We went through a summary hearing. And obviously there was a consequence for that. I have responsibility for that, and I would suggest I've probably paid for it in spades.
One of the things that comes up in politics, as anyone who's been a candidate can tell you, is that you're very much a casualty of a war that is bigger than you in a lot of ways. And, people that don't like the Liberals see this guy and they think he's the weak link of the Liberal campaign. So that motivates the Liberals to cut bait in the way that they did. How was that for you on a personal level? Because it was not personal for the people that just didn't like you because you were a politician or a Liberal. But when you're in the midst of that, that's an incredibly personal fight for you and for your family.
Well, yes. And to be fair, Andrew, I was a card-carrying Liberal for all of 3-4 weeks. But it was hard, right? To see your name dragged through the mud by people that you've never met was tough. And I think even harder was to see people that you thought were your friends and family who were there joining the Kevin parade when, I was quote unquote a rising star, to then turn around and try to climb off my carcass with the knives that they stabbed in my back. And I think one of the things that came out of that was Elizabeth, my wife, and I were very lucky to find out who our real friends were, and we're very grateful for them who have been with us and have supported us in every step of the way since.
You mentioned having been a card-carrying Liberal for just a few weeks. Let's go back to 2021 here. Why did you decide to get into politics when you did, but why did you decide to run as a Liberal?
So my predecessor was retiring, and basically I got a call a few days before Canada Day. I met him because he was my MP.
This is Adam Vaughan.
Yes. I was involved in my local community. I was, president of my condo board. I was chair of our residents association. This was a city and a community that I belonged to, and at the time had lived for over a decade, and just was involved in giving back. Just wanted to make our community better. And he essentially called me. He's like, listen, I'm retiring, and I think you should be the next MP. And so up until that point, I was never a partisan person. I had only ever run in 2018 when a bunch of people encouraged me to run because there were supposed to be new seats downtown. Obviously, Premier Doug Ford decided to change that and cut City Council in half. But at the time, I really liked the idea of City Council because it was nonpartisan. I was never a partisan person. I think every party has good ideas, and a good idea is a good idea. And so when the Liberals asked me to run, I was like, well, is Justin Trudeau really completely aligned with my values? Probably not. But I think God knows the Liberals could use people that have experience in terms of what it's like to start a business and build it from the ground up. God, they need that. And as a naval reservist, sure, I wasn't in the regular force, but I think there was a perspective there, particularly from a naval perspective that I had learned in my, I think at the time, 7. Come next month, I will serve 9 years as a Naval Reserve officer, and I thought that was a perspective that I could contribute. Obviously, I was very naive to politics, having been new to partisan politics in particular, and none of that came to pass, but that was kind of my motivation, right? My parents were refugees. Canada welcomed them when other countries are closing their borders to people in need, and so that was actually my primary motivation for joining the Navy, because I wanted to give back to the country that's given my family so much. And so when the opportunity came up to potentially serve as a member of Parliament, I was like, man, that's freaking awesome to be able to not just serve part-time in uniform, but also to do it as part of my day job. Who wouldn't want that?
If you had been, not even as a candidate, if you had been a voter in a riding that was a perfect three-way split, NDP, Conservative, Liberal, any one of them could have won. We can't say a coin toss, but if there were a three-sided coin, it would have been a three-sided coin toss. Would you have voted Liberal in that election, naturally? Because part of the problem in some cities is that if you're going to run as a candidate, there are only a couple of options that could be available to you as a winner, and not to besmirch whoever the Conservative is going to be in Spadina for York. It's not a traditionally Conservative riding. So would you have aligned with the Liberals under that scenario I just laid out?
It's a good question. I know I can tell you for a fact I wouldn't vote for the NDP. They do not reflect my values. I think, like a majority of Canadians, I'm pretty centrist. This is where I think it would depend on the candidate itself, which is how our system should work. I was mentioning to you, Andrew, before I guess we started rolling, in 2019, Andrew Scheer's team asked me to run for the Conservatives. They're just, at the time, they had asked me to run in a place that was not viable. And so in this case, I guess when the Liberals came asking for me to run and they invited me to do so, it was in a riding where I knew that if I worked hard enough as an individual candidate, that I could win.
So when the Conservatives came to you with that ask in 2019, notwithstanding the riding wouldn't have been one that they were likely to carry or did carry, was that something that you could have seen fitting? Was that something you could have seen working for you to run for that party?
Yeah, so under your scenario where it was kind of like, every party has an equal footing, and where I think it's up to the candidate, and if someone can outwork others, which I believe I could do, I would have ran for Andrew Scheer's team.
One of the interesting things, just to fast forward to you being an independent in Parliament, is you spoke up and I think very eloquently took aim at what's become one of the Liberals' flagship policies, which is the carbon tax. And you were actually, I'd say, very cruelly mocked by Justin Trudeau in response to that question by saying, your voters voted for a carbon tax, was basically what he was saying, and you're parroting Conservative talking points. And I'm curious what you thought about that, both the tone, but also that substance, that you would have in a different universe, been running on and governing on a carbon tax that now you're standing up and saying, this isn't doing it for Canadians?
So there's two things I'll say to that, Andrew. That entire question period, Justin Trudeau was his kind of response back to the Conservatives in particular was like, why are you making it about me? Why are you making it personal? It's supposed to be about the policy or Canadians. And then came my question, and then he did hypocritically exactly what he criticized the Conservatives for doing, which is making it personal about me. Now, what I will say about the Prime Minister is he is unfortunately so far out of touch that he doesn't realize that, yes, I think all MPs now had run on a platform of some form of a carbon tax, but a lot had changed from when we had run in 2021 to at that time in 2023, right? You need to be adaptable. You need to be able to change your policies. They can't just be written in stone, because the reality is, since those 2 years at the time of when we had that question, food inflation was the highest as it had ever been in 40 years, right? Food bank usage was up. You should be able to adapt to the realities that everyday Canadians are facing. And that's what I was doing, right? You know, the carbon tax clearly now, unfortunately, has shown that it's not effective. Why would you continue to do something that is making it more painful for Canadians? And I think the reality is the Prime Minister doesn't know what it's like to have to worry about making next month's rent or putting food on the table, whereas my family has.
You're right that there's a past dependency in politics, and I find a lot of the time that there's so much wisdom that suggests you can't admit you were wrong, you can't be wrong, and you have to just go all in, full steam ahead on whatever you said previously. And I mean, on one hand, we don't like politicians who flip-flop for reasons that look more like they're political in nature rather than earnest. But you're also describing something there, which I think is a big failing of the political system, which is that very few people are willing to take a step back and say, okay, this didn't work, or this isn't working, or you know what, even if you support a carbon tax, which I've been pretty clear on the show I don't, but even if you support one, okay, Canadians cannot afford this right now. And the number of people in the Liberal caucus that have done that is basically one. I think Ken Hardy from Newfoundland. So there must be privately, and I'm curious about this, some more misgivings that people are not willing to share publicly. Have you experienced that?
So I have heard from kind of Liberals in the grapevine that said, you know, that I am articulating a lot of positions, whether it is on the Israel and Hamas war or the carbon tax, a position that they share, but for one reason or another don't feel comfortable articulating publicly. And that's a shame, right? That they're in a position where they can't speak up for their constituents who are struggling to make ends meet, right? You know, they'll continue to parrot these lines either by choice or because they've been whipped to do so, you know, in spite of what the evidence and the facts show. The parliamentary budget officer has said that the carbon tax, contrary to what the Liberal line is, actually hurts more Canadians than it helps, whereas the Liberal line somehow flips that.
Yeah, they basically say everyone's profiting from the carbon tax, which I don't think people buy when they go to the gas station, but nevertheless.
Exactly, and they're getting taxed twice, right? So HST is also applied on top of the carbon tax. And so they're getting dinged twice, and you know, everyone's heating bill is basically double, because if you look at the line items, the carbon tax is half.
So going back to your election, you are elected as a Liberal, you're the winner. You know that you're not going to be sitting in the Liberal caucus, at least right away. Was that a bittersweet night, or was it all positive and that you've been dragged through the ringer and you beat it?
It was not a bittersweet night. You know, if you ask my father-in-law, he's recounted this to me, because it was a very long election, in the sense that the ballots were being counted. The lines for the voting stations were actually really long in mine. And I remember fielding text messages from constituents and friends who live in Iran. They're like, Kevin, I don't understand. Are you still a Liberal or are you not? And I would have to kind of go through that process of explaining, actually, I'm no longer a Liberal. It'll still say Liberal on the ballot, but I'm independent now. And they're like, okay, I don't care. I know you, and I want to support you, and I'm going to vote for you. I just wanted to know, you know, what the deal is. And I'm grateful to all those people who, you know, I spent 10 years living in the community. They knew who I was, right? Whatever kind of the headline said. And so that night, I ended up kind of just going to bed. I was like, it's kind of painful watching reruns of them, kind of the newscaster going through, oh, Kevin's kicked out and all this. I was like, hey, I've heard it once, I've heard it now.
Yeah.
And my father-in-law told me him and my mother-in-law had stayed up, and we were with them that evening. And in the morning, when they saw that I had won, they knocked on the door, and were like, hey, Kevin, you won. And I was like, oh, okay. And apparently, I don't remember this at all. And they're like, apparently I then just rolled back over. And kind of that was it, right? Because you got to put yourself in, I'm the son of immigrants, refugees. We had nothing. We had to work hard to build up everything that we had. And in this case, the one thing that all of us have is really our name and our reputation. And I spent 30 plus years building it up, only for a false allegation to basically have it kind of tossed aside and dragged through the mud. And the hardest thing for me too is, at that time I had spent 6.5 years, I think, contributing to the Navy and helping to kind of build up the Navy's awareness and reach locally in the city as well as the GTA. And I was proud of that. And because of one mistake, which again, I own, I basically kind of washed all of that contribution impact away. At least that's how I had felt, right? So, I was so proud of my service in the Navy, and now I was the one who had kind of hurt the Navy. And I had hurt my family, my friends who had supported me. And it was just so, I don't know how to describe it now, but it was just, it was really hard. And so it was not bittersweet. It was really tough.
Did you have a sense that, once I get to Ottawa, this will all be sorted out, the Liberals will welcome me back after a month in the penalty box? Did you have either a presumption or even a calculation of likelihood that you'd be welcomed into the Liberal caucus at some point in the near future?
Not really.
Did you want to be?
Well, so at the time I was like, well, sure, I was card-carrying member for 3-4 weeks, but that's also the only team that I kind of quote-unquote was officially a part of, right?
You knew no one else was going to pick you up. It was either whether they would forgive you or whether you'd be living what you're living now.
Yeah, so, at the time I was like, well, maybe through hard work. And, folks had told me, Kevin, like most independents would have just kind of kept their head down, cast their check, and then just kind of rode out however long the mandate would be, right? And for me, I was like, well, that's just not who I am, right? I volunteered to serve, both, that was a case for the Navy and that was a case to serve in public office. And I remember when I was kind of talking to friends about, when my predecessor asked me to run and the Liberals had wanted me to be their candidate, people were like, Kevin, don't do it. Why would you, our startup was doing really well. They're like, why would you get off the rocket ship? I was teaching at Western at the time, our alma mater. I was serving in the Navy, and my naval career was going well, and the business was going well. Why would you get off the rocket ship and off an otherwise great private civilian career and subject yourself to the vulgarity of public office? And in many respects, they were right, but I naively was like, well, this is about giving back to the country that gave my family so much. And so, I had already given that up to be able to serve in public office. And I was going to do the job. I'm going to do what I was elected to do. And that means going out and doing the hard work and setting up for the issues that are important to my community and what I believe to be important to the country.
Did you view being an independent as a handicap at first, or did you relatively early see, this could actually be an advantage?
It was hard because when a normal, I guess, typical MP is elected, they have a support system, right, that the party provides that kind of guides you through that. It's like there's like an onboarding. The House of Commons has that too for everyone, but it is not as in depth. There's no support network there. And so I kind of had to muddle through and figure out stuff on my own.
Well, and you still, to be frank, had a toxicity about you as well at the time, where some people that even thought you were wrong probably wouldn't want to be caught in a photo with you by a journalist, right?
Yeah, exactly, right. And there were times where I would be walking the riding, doing what I think an MP should be, knocking on doors, checking into small businesses, and random people would kind of start yelling at me and accosting me. I think the worst part, And one of the things that I think I regret not doing at the time was, there's a reporter from CBC and a few others that would have cost my wife, then my girlfriend, when she was walking our dog. I wasn't even there, right? There's a CBC reporter, like tabloid style, kind of outside our condo, just waiting for Kevin to emerge. And I regret not reporting that to the CBC ombudsman and the ombudsman more writ large.
What was it for you that maybe flipped that switch where you started to have the attitude that you seem to express now, which is that being an independent is actually a bit of an advantage? Maybe it's not ideal, but it opens up doors that you don't have when you're whipped, when you're, kind of glued to a platform. Was there a specific issue that kind of caused you to view that differently?
I think the carbon tax is where we started. And, I was one of the first, I think, to call for temporary relief, right? The Paul Martin government did that when gas prices were really high with the GST relief. Why couldn't the Trudeau government do the same when people were suffering? Food bank lines were so long and food inflation was the highest in my lifetime and the lifetime of half of all Canadians. But then foreign interference started to really rise as an issue, and I'm glad it did, and it still is, and a very important issue. And that's where I was able to speak up in a way where I know I wouldn't have been able to. I was still a member of the Liberal caucus, and it hasn't been easy. I don't think it's a coincidence that when I was starting to stand up very strongly on foreign interference, that's when we got our first bomb threat.
Explain that. What happened?
So I think depending on who you speak to, there are individuals who believe that what happened to me was not an incident by way of just kind of one bogus individual, but potentially because...
You mean the sexual assault allegation?
Correct.
Okay.
That false allegation against me could have been part of a machination over something much more broader and longer term. And that's because you don't have to be a political scientist to realize that me being the son of refugees who were persecuted by communists, who were run out of the country by communists that took everything, would not be sympathetic to the Chinese Communist Party and their agenda. And I've spoken since to quite a number of kind of experts in that field where they've described people like me, i.e. Canadian-born Chinese, as kind of being one of the CCP's kind of worst nightmares, because you're someone who's from the Chinese Canadian diaspora and that community not parroting their lines. They instead want to see kind of people who were born in the mainland who would be sympathetic to them. And so... by the time I was sworn in as a member of Parliament, that was the second time I had sworn an oath of allegiance and service to the country, right? And the first being when I joined the Navy. For me, I could not be more proud to be a Canadian. That means standing up for our values, whether or not it's easy or not.
Now, when you say this could have been an influence operation or a disruption operation, are you talking about the sexual assault allegation itself, or the kind of digging it up and giving it to the media, or both?
So it depends who you talk to. Some people say, listen, this fits the MO of Chinese Communist Party in terms of the honey trap. I think the sad reality for me when I reflect on it all is when I kind of met the complainant, I was simply looking for someone to share my life with. And I was looking for a partner. I was dating her for a few months, and then it flamed out, and then by a random encounter, although some people I thought it was a random encounter, some people said it wasn't, that I bumped into her again, and the whole kind of incident happened when she invited me over, only for her to ask, essentially have a random person come in the middle of the night that told me to leave, which was weird, but I did. And then when I went home, I woke up in the morning to 2 voicemails from Toronto police that said someone had made an allegation of sexual assault against me. And that was my first ever...
And what year was this?
This was in 2019.
And why would you have been on the radar then, in your view?
So in 2018, I had run for city council, and the election was in October. I was ultimately unsuccessful. I lost to the NDP incumbent. And in 2019, a month later or a few weeks later after my municipal election is when I had met the woman who would eventually falsely accuse me of sexual assault. And so, we were dating for a few months, and we stopped dating in February, and then I thought I randomly bumped into her again in March. And so when she invited me over, this was early April, she invited me over, she offered to give me a ride. Heck, she even asked me what pizza I wanted. And so, when I got to her place, we were going to watch a movie and hang out. And so, without going into all the details, we essentially were in bed. We fell asleep cuddling. And in the middle of the night, she woke up and she was like, oh, checks her phone. We're cuddling. So she wakes me up and she's like, oh, my friend needs me. And I was like, okay, this is still winter. It's in the middle of the night. I was like, do you want me to go with you? She's like, no. I was like, okay, can I stay here, sleep, and wake up in the morning and leave as I have previously before? She's like, sure. So she leaves, I guess, to tell her to see her friend, because that's what she told me. And the next thing I know, I wake up again. I'm woken up by a strange woman that I had never seen before, who says, I need to leave. And so she steps out of the condo so I can get dressed. And I just assume this is her friend. I don't know. And so I call an Uber, actually it's a Lyft, and I leave. And that is when I learn in our criminal justice system, despite what I think the majority of Canadians believe, where, innocent to proven guilty, police talk to both sides. I learned that through the false allegation of one individual, the police can lay a charge without having never spoken to me. And I was like, I didn't even know what to do. I had to call my best friend, who told me, Kevin, you need to get a defense lawyer. And I was like, I don't even know where I start. So I called another friend who recommended somebody and who arranged for me to surrender myself the next day to be booked by Toronto police, right? And they let me out the same day, like a few hours after they booked me. And then 7 months later, I never actually, the criminal defense lawyer is like, Kevin, this is nuts, but I'll take care of it. You try to move on with your life. And so I tried to focus on, stuff I was doing in the community and all that sort of stuff. And 7 months later, which I'm told in the criminal justice system apparently is very fast, but it didn't feel like
not when it's hanging over you like
that's
the
right.
sword of Damocles.
7 months later, the Crown completely withdrew the single charge. There was no kind of special considerations or anything like that. They completely took it off. And because I didn't even get my day in court, right? I didn't even get a chance to fight it and be declared innocent. They were just like, nope, we're not even going to take this to court, which, I kind of wish it did, because then I'd have a definitive kind of...
An acquittal is more definitive than just we're not prosecuting.
Yeah, it's completely withdrawn, right? But the issue is, if you want to weaponize a false allegation like this, all you need to do is make a false accusation, and the media runs with the story. And, the Toronto Star, I spoke to one of the three reporters in the bylines later within the context of foreign interference, and they admitted to me they never even spoke to the complainant themselves. And I was like, that's nuts. So you put your name to an article without having ever spoken to the person, and you just ran the story as it was told to you. Like, really?
So you said earlier that some people think this was interference. Are you one of those people? Do you think this was an operation?
I think the more I have learned about foreign interference, the more that is also my opinion, right? And this isn't a secret, so I can, I've sat down and spoken with CSIS as well to share what my observations are, my experiences, and what other members of the Chinese diaspora and in my community have brought to me. I remember when I requested to meet with them, I thought I'd meet with them in Ottawa, and they're like, no, you're going to meet in Toronto with our people who are specializing in this. And I thought it'd be a half an hour meeting, and it was 2 hours.
So to go back to how you've taken this experience, and I think the foreign interference issue was probably one of the first where you really started to, in my view, and the timeline's a little bit muddled now for the last couple of years, stand out as someone who, wow, this is a guy that's actually using his position, even in a not ideal situation, being an independent and trying to advocate for real change on this. It also made you, I think, very popular, certainly online among a lot of conservatives, people that, love the optics of, oh, here's a guy that ran as a liberal sticking it to the liberals. And you're feeding into sort of a partisan framework even with that. But you've also found a lot of support from people on the right for your stance on Israel and your criticism of anti-Semitism. When I kind of had the idea of doing this interview, you had kind of given a very thoughtful thread on how your thinking has evolved on the use of the Emergencies Act, and we can talk about that as well. But I'm curious how you felt about that, of finding this support in a way from people that, had you been elected in the Liberal caucus and stayed in the Liberal caucus, probably wouldn't have had much time for you.
Yeah, I think I'm as an independent, I'm grateful for any support that anyone offers. I'm willing to work with anyone if it means being able to kind of advance things that I believe are important to Canadians. That for me, that's affordability, that's housing, fighting foreign interference, and standing up for our values. And I think that's where the Israel-Hamas conflict has really made it, for better or for worse, very easy for Canadians now to be able to see who truly shares their values, whether it's standing up for, frankly, just for rule of law here in the streets of Canada, never mind what's happening in the Middle East, right? And unfortunately, especially here in the city of Toronto, where we have 25 members of parliament, 25 MPPs, and 25 city councillors, not including the mayor, I can probably count on one hand, Andrew, how many people of the 76 who have spoken out against anti-Semitism.
And this is very difficult for a lot of Liberal MPs, and I don't know too many on a personal level, but I just know that there have been a lot, even some Jewish MPs, that have been somewhat quiet and equivocal on this. People like Anthony Housefather, who's a Liberal MP who's been quite outspoken on this, have been very much in the minority. And I'm wondering, well, there's two parts to this question. Firstly, I'm just wondering what your relationships are like with Liberals and with MPs from other parties, one-on-one in Ottawa. But also, are these MPs that fundamentally believe something different from you? They fundamentally believe it, or are they MPs that have been shamed and silenced into not saying what they think, which is what you're saying?
So there are a few kind of Liberals who are kind of quote unquote the mavericks or people that have been willing to speak up. Anthony Housefather, I've gotten to know in part because he kind of sat near me, and we've since seen one another at the rallies in support of Canada's Jewish community. There are a few others like Joel Lightbound and others who had at times kind of voted despite what the party whip had said. And I actually have a lot of respect for Joel, and he is, I think, a great public policy thinker. And I hope he has a great leadership role, whatever that might be in the Liberals at some point. I've gotten to know, I think, a lot of my conservative colleagues, and the reality is we are aligned on a lot of policy positions that I think, frankly, if Liberals weren't whipped, would probably share too.
What do you mean, apart from the carbon tax?
Well, it's funny. So the carbon tax is one example that I do want to speak about, because there was, a Liberal MP, and I won't name him, but I remember I was trying to have like a constructive conversation. I was like, listen, help me to understand your position, because the reality is the carbon tax drives up gas prices. And there are people, this is an individual who represents the GTA riding, and not everyone has public transit as an option. People have to drive. And I think that's a reasonable position. And he said to me, he's like, well, Kevin, they should just drive less. And I was like, buddy, your riding is like majority drivers. How could you be so disconnected, right? And this individual is a parliamentary secretary. And it just, for me, it's so challenging. I've tried to talk to the Greens as well, where I was like, hey, help me to understand. You support Ukraine. We're aligned on that. Yes. Okay, great. Don't you think it would make sense for Canada to get our natural gas to Tidewater so that the world buys it from us instead of Russia? And also, by the way, gives us the revenue and the money to fund the advancements in the industry that you want us to put more money in. And, they'll follow my fact pattern and be like, yes, up and until building more in Canada. And they just like flip the table. And I'm just like, I don't understand it.
It breaks the brain when you go that far.
Reconcile that, right?
Yeah.
And those are the people where I think, I at a personal level, I can get along with, I think, majority of people. But when it comes to these positions, they're just so ideological, and I don't get it. The other one, and you've brought her up, Yara Sachs.
Yes.
Let's park the context of the Jewish community for a moment and just look at safe supply and the ideological fixation with giving out drugs that are proven to not only, within the euphemism of harm reduction, but really is harm facilitation. Not only now for the users themselves, because harm reduction without treatment doesn't break the cycle of addiction. It's now wreaking havoc in local communities that host these sites, including mine. My riding is home to or immediately adjacent to every single of these injection sites in the city of Toronto. And they are just have become kind of these magnets of not just petty crime, but now drug dealers, and it's needles are being found everywhere. People who sadly die from overdose being found at their bodies being found at children's playgrounds, right? And I try to raise this. There's a question I raised in the House specifically around safe supply, where experts, clinicians specializing in addiction medicine, were trying to sound the alarm to the Minister of Mental Health and Addiction, Yara Sachs, and she turns around and she starts, lambasting and yelling at me. How dare you? People are dying. And I was like, yeah, I know people are dying. And your safe supply strategy has not reversed the trend. The amount of people dying keeps going up. And yet they have these ideological kind of blinders on, and they refuse to admit that the strategy that they have put forward is not working. They won't adapt it, even though people are dying.
And I remember you posted about it on social media a few days ago. There was that very tense council meeting in Richmond, British Columbia, where you had an Asian man who was speaking about exactly what you're speaking about, just the concerns he has from his community about these things. And he's yelled at for, with all of the most, horrific slurs you could use against an immigrant. Go back where you came from. You're not Canadian. And that's what this debate has been distilled down to, that you're not allowed to say, you know what, I actually don't like drug users on the playground my kids are playing on.
Yeah, it's sad because these are the same individuals often from the ideological spectrum, the left, that will talk about, we need to be inclusive, we need to be diverse, up until you dare to stand up and articulate a position that they don't agree with. Then all of a sudden they'll call you any number of names.
You mentioned having, made some friends in the Conservative caucus, so I have to ask you the obvious question. Would you join them?
That's a good question. I think if there was an opportunity to be able to serve in the government, and all polls show that, I think the Conservatives will form the next government, who wouldn't want the opportunity to be able to contribute and, I think, course correct and right the ship of the direction that Canada has been going, which I don't think has been steered in the right direction.
Have you had any conversations, even informal, with anyone in that party about either joining their caucus or running for them as a candidate?
I think the door has always been open from my side. I've chatted with people and they're like, yeah, Kevin, I think you'd fit right into caucus, but it's not just up to me. I think it's up to party brass and the leadership as well too, to find a fit and a path.
So you've had no conversations with the leadership or with people in the higher ranks?
Listen, I've had a chance to be able to chat with the leader Pierre on occasion on the margins. I think, if that's something that they want to pursue, listen, like I said, I'm open to it.
I'm curious in a way about why, because you've had a unique experience the last 4 years in that you've been unshackled by partisanship. And I'm wondering, from the sensibilities you've shared here and at other interviews, whether you'd ever be comfortable going into that partisan framework again.
And that's a fair question. I think for me, I've always been a team player. That's especially in the military. You operate as a team, and you're always stronger together. I have not had that opportunity to be able to do that. And, I hope that maybe there will be, to be able to show how I could add value as part of a team. Because the reality is, if you look at what we've been able to, I think, to be able to deliver as an independent office, I think we've been pretty high impact, but there is only so much you can do without the support of a party, of a caucus, with a whole network of resources. There is, I think, a ceiling. And there are a lot of challenges that Canadians are facing, and I want to be able to contribute to that.
How effectively have you been able to help your constituents on files? And what I mean by that is that if you're an MP in government, you're kind of hanging out with the ministers. So you could just go up to them and be like, oh, minister, someone in my riding, and they say, oh, we'll look into it. And you don't necessarily have that. I mean, you can still try to pin a minister down in the House of Commons, but have you been able to still get progress on these constituency files that come across your desk?
A good example, I think, is during last summer, we had refugees that were on the street in Toronto. That was in my riding, just down the street from my office. And so that's something that I think I was able to raise in a way that no other Liberal MP would have been able to do so, and raise awareness and highlight for media the issues and the gaps in terms of, hey, the federal government, despite my warnings, had decided to cut money for refugees and shelters writ large completely. And I raised the alarm both in March, April, and May, and they ignored it. And what we're seeing now in the summer is a direct consequence of that, right? And ultimately, we were able to shame the government into doing the right thing and stepping up and giving the city the funding that they needed. No one can really call out the hypocrisy that we see, right? Where Justin Trudeau will love to claim the moral high ground of, yes, I'm helping refugees and people in need, which I think most Canadians would support. But you can't do that and say that without actually providing the funding needed.
Yeah.
Right? And yet they were trying to have their cake and eat it too. And so I was in a position to be able to call that out. And, I'm happy to say that we ultimately were able to shame them into doing the right thing and giving the city. And we've since seen kind of the funding from the federal government flow to other cities that are facing that onslaught of people.
If the door is not, let's say, opened on the Conservative Party side of the equation, if you're not welcomed into that party, would you run again as an independent?
Yes. I will run again. Hopefully it's with the opportunity of being able to be a part of a team and contribute to that. But if that's not the case, I will run again because I think we have a track record now. And I think it's important that we at least be another voice out there to call out particularly the hypocrisies and different positions that Canadians need to know.
As I mentioned at the outset, it's not entirely unheard of for independents to win. There was in Ontario last election, Bobby Ann Brady that won in Haldimand Norfolk as an independent. I think famously at the federal level, Jody Wilson-Raybould in Vancouver, Granville. When you see the history of independents winning, is there any lesson that you take from that on what would let you beat the odds if you do have to stand for re-election as an independent?
I think, Andrew, the reality is the odds aren't in my favor. It's not easy. There are a lot of systemic barriers. Like I can't, for example, raise money in between elections or writ periods as any other MP in a party would be able to do. Anyone who might want to donate to a riding association that actually my team and I are in the midst of starting can donate, but they won't get a tax receipt. Right, and that's
so you can actually have an independent riding association. I wasn't aware of that. Okay,
but there isn't. The weird thing is there aren't any rules that say I can't do it. Okay, it's just that I guess the Canadian bureaucrat kind of instinct is if there are no rules saying that I can explicitly do it, they just assume I can't do it.
So you almost need to create like the Kevin Vuong party and run as the candidate for Kevin Vuong. Basically.
Yeah. And so it's interesting kind of going through that experience right now. And I think Canadian democracy more broadly would probably benefit from a little bit more independence within the parties. I think that's a good thing. I think the UK is a prime example of that, where there is a lot more independence within parties for MPs to be able to speak up. And you can see that on my voting record. Sometimes I do vote with the government, more increasingly I vote against, but that is largely really driven by what my constituents' positions are. They will call in, they will write in about different positions, and in the absence of them having a particular yes or no or in support of or not, my team and I will sit back and assess the merits of the policy or the bill and vote accordingly.
Would that be your ideal scenario, that we still keep political parties, but the parties themselves loosen the stranglehold that they have over their caucus members?
So I think conceptually, yes. And I only say conceptually because I haven't had the experience of being part of a party to be able to say, like, I'm I'm really going based off of what people tell me in terms of what their kind of party experience has been. And
so you can kind of see it when everyone is standing up and voting in a certain way, when you know you've had conversations with so-and-so that they might not be too jazzed about that.
Yeah, so it's interesting because I whenever there's a vote and I sit at my desk and my desk is beside the Greens and the Liberals, and I remember one Liberal member who would come in, and so in advance of every vote, the pages would go around. They put a piece of paper on every desk of the Liberals, essentially telling them how to vote. And he would always come. I always cracked up when he said it. He was right beside me. He'd go to his desk. He would look down, be like, "Oh, it looks like I've made up my mind." And I think a lot of Canadians don't realize that that's actually how currently a lot of the votes happen. Right? They are largely whipped. I think every party does it. To the Conservatives' credit, because I've seen their paper too, it at least articulates their rationale for why they vote the way they do, which I think is a step up from what the Liberals are, which is like, you're either in favor or you're not. No thinking required.
Yeah. So maybe one little minor thing that we could do is just ban pieces of paper. Take the printers out of the House of Commons, and then every MP has to make up their mind. But that's the pipe dream, I guess.
Well, it's interesting because, sometimes like there are different opposition motions. And I remember there's a Conservative motion saying that Canada should fulfill our international commitment to NATO and hit 2%. And the Liberal instinct always is, if it's a Conservative, it's bad. So vote against it.
Don't even listen to the policy. It's opposition motion, no.
However, this time, they actually decided to vote with it. And there was a Liberal who was remote, and so I guess didn't get the piece of paper, and so by instinct voted against it, and then had to change it afterwards. And it's kind of like, shouldn't you be thinking? Shouldn't you be at least evaluating every policy, every vote on its merits? But it's not always the case.
If the supply and confidence agreement between the NDP and the Liberals hold, you've got about a year and a half left in your current term. What is it you'd like to achieve in that time? What's the goal for you?
So for me, I think it's always been trying to stand up for the city. I'm a Toronto MP. It's standing up for the people who not only elected me, but what's good for the city writ large. When 2021, in that election campaign, the Liberals had promised to give Toronto its due. And that's something that the 24 other Liberal MPs seem to have forgotten. It's also standing up for people who are struggling to make ends meet. And so, listen, I think every MP probably wants to support the environment and recognizes that there have been challenges in the climate. In Toronto, we've had flooding and extreme rains in a way that we never had before. We need to adapt to that, right? But what the current policy is around the carbon tax isn't working. And so for me, that is hopefully being able to help to support that movement. And it is true that the Conservatives and I think Pierre Poilievre are kind of leading the charge on that. But I think it helps if there's an urban MP from Toronto that is also a part of that message, which is, this is not working. The carbon tax is making it harder for more Canadians than it's helping. We need to find another way to be able to address that, as well as in a way that helps to lift up all Canadians and our prosperity.
Independent Member of Parliament Kevin Vuong, thank you.
Thanks for having me, Andrew.
Thanks for listening to The Andrew Lawton Show. Support the program by donating to True North at www.tnc.news.